The flame of the House of Ashveil was never ordinary. It was not kindled by dry wood or oil, but by bloodline, by the centuries-old, crimson-dyed lineage itself. People called it the Primordial Flame, the ancient fire, as sacred as the breath of a god, yet as terrifying as a human curse. In the family, any child chosen to carry this power revealed their mark early on. Their eyes would flash with a reddish glow, like a still-burning ember. As they grew, that flame would either become a protective weapon for the entire lineage or would consume the very person who bore it. And not everyone was chosen. In fact, most children in Ashveil lived their whole lives in the shadow of the fire-bearers, revering them, worshipping them, and also fearing them. Irene was one of the rare few who were chosen. But instead of being hailed, the day her eyes first glowed red, the whispers in Ashveil's ancient hall only grew louder. A daughter. What good is she? She'll be married off soon enough. The flame will no longer belong to this house. They looked at her as an ironic jest of fate. Blessed, but the blessing was given to the wrong person. Irene quickly learned silence. She held her back straight amid the indifferent gazes, keeping her red eyes from dropping. Yet, inside the young maiden's chest, the flame was a wild beast, both trembling and desperately longing to break free from its shackles. The only one who didn't see her as a burden was Calin, her elder brother, the golden son of Ashveil. All the family's pride, all the reverence from the kin, was focused on his shoulders. Calin was strong, calm, and the flame within him was pure as a ruby. But when he was with Irene, Calin was not a symbol, not an heir. He was just a brother, one who placed his hand on his sister's shoulder, gentle as a light in the night. One time, when Irene was little, she secretly climbed into the back courtyard where Calin was practicing. The 16-year-old boy controlled the fire as if in a dance. Streams of red and orange looped around his body, brilliant as a solar ballet. Irene watched wide-eyed, the flame inside her excitedly responding like a rapid drumbeat. "It's so beautiful," she murmured. Calin smiled, spreading his palm before Irene. A speck of fire danced in his hand, as harmless as a firefly. Irene gently touched it, hot, but not burning. Like a fragile promise. The flame within us doesn't only burn, it can also illuminate, Irene. As long as you don't fear it. From then on, whenever she was mocked, Irene recalled her brother's hand and that gentle speck of fire. But that light did not last forever. When Irene turned 16, the family held the ember rite, a fire ceremony where those who inherited the power proved their control before the entire clan. It was a momentous occasion, not just affirming individual ability but also deciding the family's standing within the alliance of fire-worshipping houses. That day, the entire Ashveil hall was ablaze with crimson light. On the sacred altar, Calin stepped out amidst roaring cheers. He was the greatest hope, and no one dared to doubt the power within him. Irene sat at the back of the seating, her hands clasped tightly, both proud and anxious. In her chest, the flame also trembled, in sync with her brother. Calin began with a few incantations. The fire flared, perfectly controlled in his hand. His flame shone, soft as a red ribbon, then erupted violently like a volcano. The entire audience gasped in awe. Irene smiled at her brother, the person she saw as a flickering sunlight amidst the deep darkness of her own life. Then, the unthinkable happened. A streak of fire lost control, viciously, as if pulled by an unseen string. It exploded, wrapping around Calin. In an instant, the gentle light of yesteryear turned into a killing blade. Screams echoed. Red blood mingled with the flame's glow. Irene shot up. "Calin!" She rushed forward. But it was too late. The whole hall descended into panic, and on the sacred altar, her brother's body was engulfed in a sea of fire. The fire was extinguished. On the cold stone floor, all that remained was ash and the acrid smell of burning, a cruel mark left behind by Calin. All eyes suddenly converged on the standing Irene. It was her. A voice rang out, sharp as a blade. She met Calin before the boy performed the rite. Irene was startled, for they spoke the truth. She had met him before the ceremony. But that meeting was simply a way for her to encourage and congratulate Kaelin. She had done nothing else. Yet, someone latched onto that to accuse her. A servant stepped forward, bowing, his voice distinct. "Elders, I saw Lady Irene sneak into the sacred altar room last night. No one else had enough motive to harm young Master Kaelin." Whispers surged, accusations tumbling like boulders. The girl. She always carried an evil flame. That's right. She shouldn't have been born at all. Irene froze, her whole body trembling. Her throat was tight, but she still managed to scream. "It wasn't me. It wasn't me. Kaelin. My brother." Her heartbreaking cries were drowned in the tide of fury. No one wanted to listen. No one wanted to believe. That night, in the cold torchlight, Irene was dragged down to the dungeons. The 4 stone walls were thick with dampness. The smell of rust from the shackles mingled with the scent of dried blood. Irene collapsed onto the moist ground, her bound hands marked with red welts. The last image was seared onto her eyelids. Kaelin, her brother, his body consumed by fire right before her eyes. The only person who had ever held her hand, who had believed in her, was now reduced to ashes. Despair weighed heavily on her chest. She leaned her head against the icy wall, her eyes red, her voice a strengthless whisper. "Brother, why you?" In the darkness, only the flame in Irene's heart still flickered. It was no longer warm. It screamed, wanting to break the shackles, wanting to devour the world that had driven her to this path. A few days later, the verdict was delivered. The Ashveil elders sat solemnly on the stone chairs, their voices cold as destiny. From now on, Irene Ashveil no longer belongs to this bloodline. She is exiled from the domain of Cinderlith, where the ancestral fire resides. If your shadow ever trespasses upon this territory again, death will await you. You shall be hanged before the populace, as a traitor. The shackles fell away, not to grant freedom, but to strip everything away. The gates of Cinderlith opened. A young woman walked out, carrying only a small pouch on her back, her heart bowed under 1,000 pounds of hatred. Tears mixed with the fire in her eyes, reflecting the pitch-black night sky. She carried her brother's wrongful death. Carried a crime that was not hers. Carried the wounds from her own flesh and blood. And also the heaviest legacy of the Ashveil bloodline, the flame. According to legend, at the dawn of creation, the fire from a red star fell to the earth, forming a source of spiritual flame. The ancestors of Ashveil were the first to approach, and instead of being consumed, they swallowed that power. From then on, Ashveil became the family that commanded the ember mark, an innate ability passed down through the bloodline. Each member born possessed an inherited flame, with its own distinct color and nature. This fire reflected their soul. It could be a cold blue burning flame, a bursting red one, or a cruel black fire. But only the children chosen truly possessed the full power of the fire. Through the rite of passage, coming-of-age ceremony, the child would obtain what was called the flame sigil, an imprint, and the fire in their body would be marked on the skin, typically on the back of the hand, the chest, or the back. The more complex the sigil, the greater the power potential. Those who had completed the rite would train themselves and successively attain specific power ranks, suitable for their ability. Typically, heirs could easily reach Flame Heart, the internal flame to boost power, shape weapons, or shields. A few could touch Flamecraft, a power that could fuse fire with the surrounding world, burning other elements or bending the laws of combustion. And the highest stage of the Embermark route, Flame Soul, a rare tier where the flame became an independent will, almost a coexisting entity with its owner. To this day, apart from the first ancestors of Ashveil, no one in the family has possessed the ability to cultivate to that degree. The Ashveil family always prided themselves that fire was a form of grace, the light of power, the symbol of noble lineage. But for Irene, fire had never been a grace. It was a sentence. The flame within her was different. From a young age, Irene's fire had the color of charcoal violet, a shade that had never appeared in Ashveil history. It flared without regularity, sometimes blazing bright, sometimes turning as dark as ash. The elders whispered that this flame carried a bad omen, foretelling ruin. Thus, Irene naturally became an eyesore to the family, the one unworthy of existence. Kalen, her brother, was the only one who protected Irene. He believed that the violet flame was not a curse but a rare mutation, perhaps an opportunity to usher in a new era. But when Kalen fell during the ceremony, that difference was immediately turned into evidence to convict Irene. And now, on the path of exile, Irene carried the charcoal violet flame in her veins. A power rejected by her family, yet the only weapon that could save or destroy her. The wind from the north blew across the arid wasteland, carrying the scent of scorched earth and a cutting chill. Every step Irene took felt as heavy as treading on ash, the ash of a life that had died that night. Behind her, the gates of Cinderlith had closed, but in her mind, they remained wide open like an unhealed wound, perpetually bleeding. In the early days of her exile, Irene didn't know where to go. The road stretched between rocky mountains and yellowed plains. The sky was always gray, as if the whole world was mourning Kalen's death. She carried a small leather pouch, a few silver coins, and an old cloak the jailer had tossed her. But the heaviest thing was what lay in her chest, the charcoal violet flame, both smoldering and ferocious, giving her no peace. At night, when everything fell silent, the fire surged. In her dreams, Irene saw Kalen standing on the sacred altar, his gentle smile turning into a scream, his body reduced to ash. She woke with a start, cold sweat mingling with the reddish-violet fire seeping from her fingertips. Each time this happened, Irene could only clutch her hands to her chest, trying to extinguish it, but the more she restrained it, the fiercer the flame burned. One night, by a small makeshift fire on a hillside, Irene heard the howl of wolves echoing nearby. Their silhouettes emerged from the forest edge, eyes gleaming yellow. Before, she would have fled in terror, but now she had nothing left to lose. Irene raised her hand, allowing the fire within her to spill out. The charcoal violet flame erupted, sweeping in an arc through the air. The wolves snarled, the alpha lunged but only managed to touch the wall of fire. The smell of burning flesh spread, the beast collapsed, its body twitching before falling still. The remaining wolves scattered, leaving behind the smell of blood and smoke clinging to the rocks. Irene looked down at her hands, still shaking from the power that had just escaped. She hadn't wanted to kill them. But the fire didn't listen to her. It chose. It's decided. She sank to the ground, holding her scorched hand before her eyes. In the violet light, Kalen's face reappeared, whispering, "Don't be afraid of it, Irene." But how could she not be afraid when it was the very thing that had swallowed him whole right before her eyes? In the days that followed, Irene trudged through poor villages where people watched her secretly from afar. Her disheveled black hair and eyes flashing red like embers made them whisper, "Wraith fire." It was a ghost fire. Even though she tried to hide it, whenever her emotions swelled, a few streaks of violet fire would escape from the corners of her eyes or her fingertips. And so people slammed their doors shut, pulling their children inside, leaving Irene standing alone in the road. She learned not to expect any look of pity. They knew nothing of Kalen. They knew nothing of the injustice branded onto her skin. Irene had no more tears left to cry. Everything inside her gradually solidified into a block of hot, red charcoal, burning in silence. One morning, as Irene followed a path along a dry riverbed, a group of mercenaries blocked her way. They wore leather armor, with a black spear insignia carved on their shoulders, bounty hunters specializing in tracking exiles. "Who are you?" The leader glared. "Irene." She replied curtly, her voice hoarse. They burst into laughter, contempt evident on every face. They knew her, of course. Irene Ashveil, the distinguished young lady recently cast out by her family for the attempted murder of her brother. Rumors about her traveled faster than any news ever had. They even called her the traitorous daughter, the cursed child. A noble lady no one needed. The red eyes. The evil flame. Truly the traitorous daughter of House Ashveil. They charged. Dozens of black-armored figures roared like hungry beasts, trampling the ash beneath their feet. Irene stepped back, but her feet felt pinned to the ground, her entire body rigid with fear and fire. She heard her own heartbeat pounding, mingling with the clash of swords and the metallic breath exhaled by her enemies. In her chest, the violet flame began to wail. Not a human sound, but like 1,000 souls whispering beneath her skin, demanding release. The first sword swung down, steel slicing the air. Irene raised her hand on instinct. A spark of violet fire shot out from her palm, touching the steel. In that instant, the world exploded. A deafening blast echoed across the plain. The light flared so fiercely it seemed to tear the sky in two. A wave of heat swept through, blowing up dust and bone shards. The smell of burnt iron and human flesh spread, thick and choking. Those who charged screamed, writhing in an invisible conflagration, their armor glowing red like embers, their flesh melting from the bone. Irene stumbled back, her hand trembling. She wanted to scream, but her throat was choked. The cries still echoed around her, then abruptly silenced. When the light faded, the wind blew through. Before her lay only a desolate plot of land, with charred bodies contorted in the ash. Lingering embers fell from her fingertips like drops of purple, clotting blood. She looked around. No one was alive. Not a single breath. Only her, standing among the ashes, beneath a sky as heavy and grey as cold cinders. Irene's eyes were vacant. She looked down at her hand, the hand that had just touched death. For the first time, she saw clearly. This was no accident. Not a miracle, not self-defense. It was blood. Real. On her hands. The road led Irene to further lands, where people spoke of a recluse from the east, once a great flamekeeper, one who understood the primordial flame, the source of all fire power in this world, better than anyone, but who had left the Council of Elders decades ago. They called him by a simple name, Master Kale. Rumor had it he lived hidden in the western mountains, where caves constantly glowed red as if containing subterranean lava. A dangerous place few dared to venture. But for Irene, it was the only path. At first, Irene thought it was just a wild tale. But the further she went, the more accounts she heard, and the more fragments of stories that were strangely similar. People said he was tall and thin, his shoulders stooped in a worn cloak, his eyes sharp as steel yet as still as cold ash. They said simply walking past him would make the flame in the heart of every fire-marked person tremble, as if seen through. The last night before leaving the plain, Irene stopped by a charred tree stump. She knelt, whispering as if to the darkness. "Kalen, if I don't learn to restrain this fire, I won't be myself anymore. And if that happens, then your death will truly be meaningless." The night wind blew through, carrying the scent of ash. Irene tightly clenched her hand, facing the distant mountains, where the horizon was stained red. A new journey began from there. The next morning, Irene set out. When she first saw the man sitting under a pine tree before a strange cave, Irene knew she hadn't been wrong. He wore coarse cloth robes, his long hair streaked with silver, his face deeply etched. In his hand was a small teapot, thin smoke rising amidst the cold wind. He looked nothing like a master. He looked like an old farmer, even someone who had been cut off from the flame long ago. "I am no one," the man said before Irene could speak, his voice calm yet firm, as if he knew what she was about to say. "They speak of a flamekeeper from the east." Irene did not back down, looking him straight in the eye. One who once controlled the primordial flame without being consumed. One who understands fire not just through strength, but through comprehension. "That person is you." The man slightly narrowed his eyes. He gave a faint smile. "Little one, you've taken the wrong path." Irene took a deep breath, then held out her hand. A charcoal violet flame erupted, growling fiercely. Yet she kept her voice steady. "My fire is unlike anyone else's. But when it sees you, it stills. It doesn't rebel. Others might deny it, but the flame doesn't lie. It recognized you before even I did." For a moment, silence enveloped them. The wind passed through the valley, carrying a faint scorched smell, as if ancient ash was being stirred. The man put the teapot down, his gaze no longer avoiding hers. Do you know what accepting this means? This is not the path of glory, but of ash. Once you learn, the fire will demand absolute honesty from you. I have nothing left to lose, she replied, her voice resolute. A long pause. Then he quietly nodded. Very well. If the flame has chosen, I have no right to refuse. From now on, call me Kale. The sky over the Lutheran plateau was dull grey, the clouds heavy as if carrying a sleeping volcano. Irene stood before a flat piece of ground, the wind whipping past, and the fire in her veins churning as if mocking her. Try again. Kale's voice echoed from behind, deep and unyielding. Irene took a deep breath, raising her hand. With just a thought, the charcoal violet spark shot out from her palm, twisting into a whip. But before it could take shape, it screamed, exploding violently and scattering in the wind like a frantic swarm of bats. A patch of earth was scorched, dust flew up, and smoke stung her nose. Irene dropped to her knees, panting. Her forehead was beaded with sweat, her eyes flared and then dimmed, leaving them red-rimmed with disappointment. Kale walked over. He neither scolded nor comforted. He just spoke, each word like a knife touching the wound. The fire isn't rebelling. You are rebelling, Irene. She clenched her hand, offering a weak rebuttal. But it won't obey me. Kale stared at her, his eyes seeming to pierce through her skin, reaching the root of her soul. The flame listens more than you think. But it doesn't listen to commands. It listens to the truth. If your mind is chaotic, it will be chaotic. If you are afraid, it will attack. If you are hateful, it will destroy. His words felt like a slap. An image of Kalen, her brother collapsing in the sea of fire, his last look reflecting desperation and love, flashed in her mind. The pain resurged, pressing heavily on her chest. Kale continued, his voice slower, like a rhythm tapping into her will. You are looking at the fire as an enemy, but the fire is you. To control it, you must first learn to look honestly at yourself. The training lasted until sunset. Irene sat flat on the ground, her hands still trembling from the lingering heat. Her chest heaved, but in her eyes, a new spark flickered, fragile yet resolute. She slowly held out her hand. A speck of flame, pale violet like a nocturnal flower petal, danced on her fingertip. It did not explode, did not betray. It was gentle, if only for a moment. Tears welled up spontaneously. For the first time, Irene felt it. The flame within her didn't just burn. From a distance, Kale watched silently, his aged face softening slightly. He neither praised nor spoke further. Because he knew, if this girl had touched the truth of the fire, then the path ahead, though covered in blood and ash, she would continue to walk. In the days that followed, Irene was immersed in an endless cycle of fire and ash. During the day, she stood amidst the vast plateau, concentrating to keep the flame from exploding. Once, with just a momentary flicker of hesitation, the violet fire swept through a patch of land, leaving the smell of burning thick in the air. Irene's entire body was scorched, her hands numb, but she just grit her teeth and stood up. Kale never scolded, he just sat far away, his eyes sharp as if seeing through her every movement, every breath. You are trying to imprison it, he said one afternoon, as Irene collapsed onto the ground, her chest heaving. But fire is not meant to be caged. It will only stay if you agree to listen. At night, when Kale had extinguished his lamp, Irene still sat alone in the darkness. The flame flickered in her palm, brilliant yet fierce. She didn't know how many times she let tears fall, dropping onto the cold ground, mixing with the ash. Each tear felt like a question. Why was her fire different, hated, and the mark of her exile? Yet, with each failure, the fire in Irene's hand gradually stopped rebelling. It no longer screamed wildly every time it was summoned. Under Kale's patient gaze, Irene realized, sometimes gentleness is stronger than restraint. One evening, after Irene completed a long series of exercises, the fire in her hand flared up and then shrank into a small, steady, and clear orb of light. Kale walked over, gently placing a hand on her shoulder for the first time. You've gone further than I expected. His voice was hoarse but warm. But fire isn't only learned in mountain caves or on the Lutheran plateau. It exists out there, in the wind, in the ash, in every glance of people. Irene looked up, her eyes still wet. Do you want me to leave, Master? Kale nodded softly. You are strong enough now not to be afraid of yourself. Lucid enough to listen. Now is the time for you to go out into the world, for the fire within you to learn to speak with the fire outside. I will take you down to the plains. After that, you must continue alone. On the day she left the cave, the early mist covered the peaks of the western mountains in white. The two stood before the path leading down to the valley. Irene tightly clutched her small pouch, her heart both eager and full of uncertainty. Kale looked at her for a long time, then spoke slowly. The power of fire is a double-edged sword. It can save everything, and it can also consume everything. Don't let the fire control you. Don't live in self-pity because of it. Let it become a companion, not a chain. He paused, his gaze distant as if looking through the mist. I don't wish for you to achieve the great accomplishments the Ashveil family was obsessed with. I only wish for you to be yourself, Irene. This path. You must walk it yourself. Irene quietly nodded. The flame in her palm trembled and then stabilized, as if responding to the farewell. As she turned and stepped down the slope toward the plains, the morning wind carried the lingering smell of ash. But this time, the ash was no longer an end. It was a beginning. Irene stopped on a rock outcrop, taking a deep breath. No more cold stone walls, no more condemning stairs. Only the wind, the light, and an endless expanse. In the palm of her hand, the tiny flame flickered, reflecting the yellow of the sun. For the first time, Irene felt it was no longer a wound, but like the silent heartbeat of the earth and sky. She began her journey across the plains. During the day, the sun scorched her shoulders, but the cool wind from the south soothed her every step. At night, the steppe was silent, only the sounds of insects mingling with the blanket of stars. On those nights, Irene often sat alone by a small fire, quietly watching the flame burn, no longer fiercely, but flickering as if telling an ancient story. The world was much larger than the closed domain of Cinderlith. Along the way, Irene met roaming merchants, minstrels recounting the legend of the primordial fire, and tribes who had tried to touch it. They looked at the strange fire in Irene's hand with curiosity. Some admired, others were wary. Every whisper, every gaze exchanged, made it clearer to her. This road would not be easy, but she was no longer alone. One night, Irene lay down on the grassland, staring wide-eyed at the stars. In the rustling wind, she seemed to hear Kale's words echoing. Don't let the fire control you. Turn it into a companion. But how could fire be a companion, and not a knife held against her heart? Irene carried this question every day, with every step across the endless plains. One afternoon, as the setting sun dyed the steppe crimson, Irene stopped before a small village by a river. There, a fire was burning, but not from a stove or a torch, but from a house fiercely engulfed in flames. The villagers panicked, scooping water, throwing wet blankets, but the fire consumed the roof. Irene's heart pounded, her hand clenched. She heard a desperate shriek. There are children inside. The ferocious flame licked the wooden frame. The roof cracked. Intermittent cries for help echoed from within. The villagers were blocked by the heat. No one dared to risk rushing in. Irene didn't think for a second longer. She stretched out her hand, and the charcoal violet fire erupted, twisting around the red blaze as if to subdue it. Under stunned eyes, she rushed straight into the sea of fire. The heat tore at her lungs. Thick smoke clung to her throat. She coughed violently, her eyes stinging, but the red glow in her eyes shone bright. The violet fire enveloped her body, like a makeshift armor. Where? Irene yelled amidst the fire's roar. A weak cry answered from the corner of the room. A little girl was trapped beneath a collapsed wooden beam. Irene clenched her hand, the fire within her twisting into a band of light. lifting the beam for a brief moment. She pulled the child into her chest, shielding her with a violet flame, and then rushed straight out, through the collapsing Red Sea. As Irene burst out of the house, the wooden roof crashed down behind her, dust scattering like a final explosion. The villagers rushed over, erupting in tears and thanks, their hands trembling as they embraced the surviving child. Irene knelt, her shoulders heaving. Her hair was covered in ash and dust, sweat and tears mingling. But the fire in her eyes shone clear, no longer just hatred or flight. It was the evidence of a choice. In the midst of the chaotic crowd, a figure watched silently. An archer stood leaning against a half-burnt wooden post, her bright brown hair tied up, her grey eyes cold as steel. A longbow was slung over her shoulder. A quiver marked with scratches hung at her hip. As Irene handed the child over to the family, the other's gaze never left her. That evening, as the villagers held a hasty Thanksgiving meal, Irene sat quietly outside, watching the fire flicker in the night. A low, hoarse voice spoke from behind her. "Violet flame. Rare indeed." Irene turned around. The archer stood in the darkness, her eyes bright as if seeing through her. "Who are you?" Irene asked cautiously. "Lyra Duskfall," the archer replied curtly. Her gaze remained cold but not hostile. "I lost my family to a fire. Not an ordinary fire. It was a fire manipulated by one who sits upon a throne, Lord Vaynar." The name resonated, heavy as a blow to Irene's heart. She clenched her hand, the fire in her palm flickering fiercely. Lyra moved closer, sitting down beside her. Her voice was low, hoarse but sharp as an arrow. "You are not like the fire-bearers I've met. You fight it, you don't use it to trample others. But because of this, you will be drawn into this war. Whether you want to or not." Irene looked over, her red eyes flashing. "Can you tell me more about Lord Vaynar?" Lyra nodded lightly. "One day you will have to face him. I'm not sure you're ready. But if you truly want to, I will go with you. As for him..." Lyra suddenly trailed off, her gaze moving toward a vague distance. A rush of memories washed over her, filled with the smell of blood, char, and burnt flesh, of the night the Duskfall family was consumed by fire. The crimson fire devoured the manor. Screams, collapse, the sound of soldiers trampling. Her parents tried to get the surviving children out, but there wasn't enough time. A fiery arrow shot from nowhere, plunging into her father's chest. Her mother screamed, then her entire body was consumed in the fierce blaze.